Please, let us pray. Iron Fist, who art in Brisbane, Trevor be thy name, with velvet glove and 12th man, podcast be thy game. Give us this day our weekly podcast, to expose those who would trespass against us. Lead us not into superstition, but deliver us from bullshit. For thine is the podcast, for the politics and the ethics, for the beer and the banter. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Yes, dear listener, this is the Iron Fist Velvet Glove podcast. Thoughts and prayers, the theme of the podcast, perhaps, to some extent. I thought we'd start with prayer and get out the road. This is an Australian podcast. We talk about news and politics, sex and religion. We talk about what's going on in the world, try and figure it out, try and make some observations. I'm Trevor, the Iron Fist. With me, as always, Scott the Velvet Glove.
G'day Trevor, g'day Paul, g'day listeners.
And also, of course, Paul the 12th man.
G'day Scott, g'day Trevor, g'day everyone.
Very good. So, dear listener, we're going to be talking about the bushfires. We're going to be talking about the Q&A, feminist edition, wokeness, various topics like that. How Labor lost the election.
And can they ever win one again?
Yep, and things like that. So we'll see how we go. Stick with us and enjoy the ride. If you're watching in the chat room, then you are very welcome to make comments, and we'll try and bring those in as people make them. So welcome to everybody who might come into the chat room. Right. So, well, gentlemen, bushfires, there's a lot of them. It's a pretty bad situation. And normally politicians love natural disasters, whether it's a flood or whether it's a bushfire or a shooting or something like that. Because, let's face it, it's an opportunity for a politician to get in front of the cameras and put forward a whole bunch of motherhood statements, praise the volunteers who are working, implore the public to pull together, and normally they get a bit of a free run and it's free publicity. I can distinctly remember Anna Bligh in Queensland, our state premier, Scott. She was in pretty low regard, and we had a flood came along and she cried and said, Queenslanders will always fight or something along those lines. And her stocks went up, 5 or 6 points immediately.
Exactly.
So they're used to having
Then along came Campbell Newman and yes.
But it's certainly a natural disaster is normally a pretty good thing for a politician. And they just get annoyed when someone tries to interrupt with questions about policy, which is a pretty rare thing. It doesn't normally happen. But it seems to be happening, Scott, on this occasion, where because people are relating the bushfires to climate change, then once they get through their spiel about, how great the volunteers are and et cetera, the very next question is, well, isn't this all your fault because of climate change and all the rest of it? And they're not enjoying it. Did you have any, gentlemen, thoughts?
Then they decry the way people make it a political issue. They say, "Oh, let's keep politics out of this."
Yes.
This is a time when we all need to come together.
Yes.
Yeah, it may well be the time that we all need to come together. But, one of the things that John Howard said about the 2007 election was that there was a perfect storm. No, not the 2007. Yeah, the 2007 election when he lost the election. He said there was a perfect storm. You had a millennial drought that had been going on for God knows how long. You had bushfires and everything, and suddenly the public demanded something be done about climate change. So then along comes Rudd and said, this is the greatest moral economic disaster that we've ever faced. We've got to do something about it. And he gets in, he fails to act. No, the Greens actually prevent him from acting. The Greens are responsible for Australia not having a carbon pollution reduction scheme. It is their fault, and anyone that votes Green should hang their head in shame. However, I'll move off that. Where was I headed with all that? So he said that was the perfect storm that led to him losing the election. Pretty hard to argue with that. I think not Costello, what's his name? Morrison is potentially facing a new perfect storm around climate change. Now, it's whether or not the public still remembers all this in 3 yees' time, 2.5 years' time.
They won't remember. They can do whatever you like.
What do you
for
think
the next
is
2 years.
the memory span of the average voter?
Like, similar to a goldfish. I would think.
It's not long.
No, people just don't pay attention. The don't pay attention. So they can get away with whatever for the
Our
next 2
listeners
years.
pay attention.
They do.
Yeah, but
And they've got
there are
long
not
memories.
enough of them to
No.
to swing the election.
They've got some long
unfortunately.
memories. But let's look at some of the quotes that have been made about this. Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack. So,
Yeah, he's off his medication, isn't he?
so he's the one who said to the Pacific Islanders, "What are you doing complaining? You're going to be fine. And
Yeah.
stop whinging about Australia because we let you pick our fruit."
Exactly.
Seriously, that was his line. So
Yeah.
that's the calibre of guy we're talking about here. And he has said that the Greens were inner city raving lunatics for discussing climate change as fires spread across the state. And he said that we've had fires in Australia since time began. What people need now is a little bit of sympathy, understanding, and real assistance. They need help, they need shelter. They don't need the ravings of some pure, enlightened, and woke capital city greenies at this time when they're trying to save their homes. So, look, he's a raving lunatic, but there's some clever politics in this
There is, yeah.
because this is in line with the tactic of Morrison and his group.
Which is divide the population.
Divide the population into the elite, urban, woke
Exactly.
community.
Latte sipping, so-called.
Exactly.
And then everybody else.
Yep.
So he's trying to cement in the country vote, is he?
Well, that
McCormack would be because he's the National Party.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
the people who don't perceive themselves as the elite. So that's who they're setting this up the entire time and basically saying everybody else is crazy lefty wokeness and we're just trying to get on with the job. So, that's part of the picture that he's painted. Barnaby Joyce said, "I acknowledge that the two people who died were most likely people who voted for the Green Party, so I'm not going to start attacking them. That's the last thing I want to do."
That was an odd thing to say, wasn't it?
Yes.
How would you assume anyone who died in a bushfire was a
Yes.
Green voter?
Yeah. That was an odd thing to say.
Based on what? I just
Yeah.
didn't
It's a
really
very
understand.
odd thing for him to say.
And what if they weren't Greens? Then he would have attacked them.
He
Again,
would have attacked the Greens if the guys that had died weren't Green voters.
yes. And he says, "I wish Adam Bandt would do is not try to extend this argument to political purposes." So when this is the thing. When there's a shooting in America, they say, "Oh, let's not talk about gun control at this important time. Let's think about the families and thoughts and prayers." Well, it's the ideal time to be talking about
Indeed.
what to do is
to his
when these
credit,
events happen.
Obama did. You remember the Sandy Hook massacre?
Yes.
And Obama did make it an issue.
Yes.
He said, look, at times like this, it's obvious there's a
Yes.
problem. We need to do something about it.
Yeah. I watched the first 10 minutes of Q&A last night and there was a intro question about is the government at fault because of their policies? And the Labor guy said, well, at this time, I'm not going to talk about politics. It was like, well, if I was the compere of Q&A, I would have said, well, I wish you told us that before we invited you. Would you mind vacating that seat
Yeah.
and we'll put somebody on who's actually
Indeed.
going to say something? But
Yeah.
that was his line at
Because
that
they
point.
specifically invite a member of the government, a member of the opposition quite often, don't they? Because they want a political perspective.
You would think so. His perspective was not to have a perspective at this point in time.
Yeah, it was odd for him too, because he's usually quite outspoken.
This is the whole point with climate change. Climate change takes a long time to get where we're at. It's going to take us an even longer time to unwind it and get back to something normal. So I don't think we can throw rocks at Morrison right now for this particular set of bushfires. However, he and Bolsonaro and Trump and the other global leaders that aren't doing anything, they are responsible for this.
It just means we're going to have presumably more of it in the future as the place gets
Absolutely,
hotter if
yeah.
you're not going to do anything about it. So anyway,
I just think that it's called global warming for a reason because it is global. You've got to act globally to fix the problem. So even if Australia did go to 100% renewable tomorrow and all our cars are electric power from the renewable grid, we're not going to be able to change where the world's headed.
I agree, but I think people can say do you see how serious the problem is?
Absolutely.
ScoMo?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
you're not doing anything about it.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Yep.
Why did you only watch 10 minutes of last night's
Well,
program?
at
Because
that
that's
point,
enough that he was about to get pissed off.
when the
with it.
Labor guy said, "Oh, this is not the time to talk about politics,"
I watched a bit more.
really?
And is it Ross Garner?
Mm-hmm.
He was actually quite interesting. And he said he thinks Australia could utilise a lot of renewables, like solar power, wind power, whatever, and, you know, on a large scale, and actually, what do they call it? Value add to our mineral exports. Instead of just exporting giant shiploads of iron ore and aluminium ore, he said we should be making it into metal here and exporting the metal product rather than just the ore.
Right. Oh.
We have
I
the
could
resources.
I could only hang in for so long.
Okay.
So forgive me on that one.
Yeah,
So-
and there was an interesting woman from the United States who is involved in, you know, the executive level of some kind of business there, and she was talking quite interestingly about the way in America. She said, actually, the Liberal Party guy was saying we need more continuity of investment to really get new industries going. You can't just say to a new business, a startup, we'll give you $1 million, and then when you've used that up, come back to us and we'll think about giving you another $1 million. You know, she said in the United States, fortunately for them, startup businesses get a lot of support. They get a lot of money thrown at them, and they can actually go places with it where they don't have to continually keep asking for more money.
Well, they do keep asking for more money because venture capitalists basically give them a drip feed, and then when the crunch comes, they cut off the money and try and take over the company from the original founders. So they play a very hard game, the venture capitalists.
Okay.
And the advantage, though, that those industries have in America is they've got very liberal bankruptcy laws. So it's much easier to start something, give it a go, and if it's looking sour, to pull the pin, and you can continue to operate as a director of other companies.
Oh, I see.
Whereas here in Australia, we're a lot tougher on people, and I think it's called Chapter 11 bankruptcy or something like that over there. So they've got different bankruptcy laws to make it more attractive to have a go, because if you fail, you're not crippled for life in your corporate career. So
Well, the Liberal Party guy, he was from New South Wales, not federal, but he was saying basically we need something like that in Australia to get new industries up and running.
yeah, but you know, over there it'll just be tech because they've got tech people.
Indeed.
But if it just relies on labour, then you won't get an industry here because labour's cheaper elsewhere. So, yeah.
What about Ross Garneau's idea of setting up metal production facilities?
The thing is, you're going to need a hell of a lot of electricity to do that.
Yes.
And the
Well, he reckons that it's available in Australia potentially if we build the infrastructure.
Well, we'll have to wait and see because Australia's got to get off coal. There's no doubt about that. You know,
Although you can't get off coal completely because you need coking coal to make steel.
well, that's the whole point. You're going to have to burn some coal. Now, Garneau, I heard him say that you could do it and you'd be exporting the metal overseas, and it would be made with cheap, renewable, clean energy over here. So it's going to be cleaner.
Okay, so our advantage is that we've got cheap energy to do it with.
That's what he reckons.
Yeah, that makes sense. But
But the coking coal that Paul's just talked about, that's not cheap and clean energy. That's dirty energy because it's burned.
Well, someone made the point.
Okay.
It might not have been on Q&A, it might have been something I read, that the forests of Europe, before they discovered that coal could be used to make steel, they used to chop down forests and burn wood and use charcoal. And then they discovered that they could do the same thing and do it better with coal. And they said that's the only reason there's any forests left in Europe.
Right. They discovered coal
Yeah,
before they wiped them all
yeah,
out.
yeah.
That makes sense. Well, and also then they just took, when they needed wood, they took it from overseas, from the colonies as well. So
And apparently in the UK, somebody is importing wood, pelleted wood from North America
right.
as a fuel. to burn
Right.
to produce electricity? That sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Don't know anything
Because
about
they call it a renewable, because it's trees,
Right.
and they reckon they can replant them and grow them again.
Right. Well, if it's plantation timber, that
Yeah,
is
but it's still
renewable.
producing carbon pollution, surely.
Yes.
Burning
But
wood.
it's also got to suck the carbon dioxide when it grows from a little sapling right up to a tree. It's still got to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere first.
Yeah,
Yeah,
although
if you've replaced your tree that you're burning with 10 trees that are growing, you're okay. But so is that calculation used? Ross in the chat room says just about the chapter 11 I was referring to, that you can't claim it if you can't pay your student debt, though. So
No, that's
they'll
right.
get you for that. Yeah.
Well, the student debt can't be written off. It can't ever be written off. You've got to pay that back. Yeah.
And Wheat Watcher says he used to import wood pellets and palm kernel into the UK to be burnt. There you go. Our friend
There
Wheat
you go.
Watcher from us.
Thanks,
So
Wheat
it does-
Watcher.
Does happen. Yeah. Okay. Now, before we get on to Q&A, the feminist edition, Karen in the chat room just mentioned about my comment about the veterans card and that I poo-pooed the veterans card. And I think at the end of the day, I said, look, have a veterans card, but I don't want overt glorifying of our veterans in everyday life,
yeah, like at airports.
like getting on the airplane, or if somebody is introduced on radio or television and it's mentioned in passing that they are in the Defence Force, that we then stop and say, thank you for your service. And that's what I object to. By all means, have a card and get something cheap, but this sort of stopping to glorify people or to
I
pay
think you can-
particular attention, I have a problem with.
I think you can glorify them on Anzac Day.
Yes,
And
one day
Remembrance,
a year.
and
And
Remembrance
Armistice
Day.
Day.
Remembrance Day, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Those times.
So those 2 days a year, I think you can glorify them then, but then the rest of the days, I don't
yeah,
think. I don't-
glorifying may not be the right word, but
But
I
you
think-
should. I think you should thank a vet.
I think it's
on
honouring them
Anzac
rather
Day,
than
yeah.
glorifying them.
Yes, thank you. The better word. But my point is that that overt sort of stopping and making something special verbally about them is what I object
It's a bit
to.
ostentatious, isn't
Yeah,
it?
it's got, and it leads on to other things. So yeah. Anyway,
But you know what? Can I just mention one thing? I saw on the news the British commemoration for Armistice Day, and they showed an old World War II era aeroplane, a Dakota, I think it was, flying over the cliffs of Dover, and some guy on board heaving bags of red things that were supposed to represent the petals of red poppies
right.
out of the door of the plane
Yeah.
to flutter in the breeze
Yeah.
down. And they were flying over the cliffs. And, we've heard all this, and quite rightly, the idea we shouldn't be just hurling stuff into the atmosphere that might drift into the ocean and be swallowed by a turtle or a fish or whatever.
Right.
And here they are flying over the cliffs of Dover, hurling bags and bags of this red, I don't know what it was made of.
Presumably it wasn't plastic.
Hopefully.
Presumably it was just
Yeah.
petals.
One would have thought it would be cardboard.
No, it wouldn't have been real petals.
Okay.
Because it was millions and millions of them, I mean, it would have been something manufactured, but from what I'm just
sure it
not
would have been
sure.
biodegradable. I'm sure.
Let's hope.
Let's hope so. Okay.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
they've just killed a lot of fish and turtles.
And Ross in the chat room says he's a veteran, totally agrees. The card is fine if they want to look after vets, fix the DVA. This is the other thing, is the hypocrisy that happens, particularly in the States, where they say, thank you for your service, blah, blah, blah. But
Yeah.
meanwhile, treat them like shit.
Yeah.
when they-
And a
when
lot
they're
of them
injured.
live on the
Yeah.
streets, apparently, after
Yeah.
discharge.
Yeah. So, right. Just finally, there was an article in The Shovel about Morrison and his thoughts and prayers. And from The Shovel it says, saying his government would do whatever it takes to fight the increasing number of fires in Australia, Prime Minister Morrison has committed to an unprecedented 2 million thoughts and prayers per year to struggling fire departments, on top of existing thoughts and prayers already delivered. He said that the thoughts and prayers could be deployed quickly and cheaply.
Yes.
Quote, while others are talking about complex, expensive initiatives like funding firefighters or addressing climate change, we're actually putting real, practical, fully costed measures in place today. 1 or 2 conversations with Hillsong, and I can have this policy on the ground and fully delivered within a week.
Well, you've got to hand it to him. It's cheap.
Right.
It's cheap because it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost anything.
Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that part of what McCormack was doing was painting the picture of the urban elites and who are out of touch with the average Australian. Meanwhile, the Liberal coalition government is in touch. And the problem is that the left is not selling to these people an alternative. And the more I think about the previous election, the more it was like, you guys are shit who want to do mining and who want to do these other things and just stop it. And nobody ever said to them, here's something we'll offer you in place so that you can put food on the table.
Exactly.
And it was upon reflection, it's sort of a carbon copy of what happened in America where, they would Hillary called them the deplorables.
Basket of deplorables.
Yeah, it's a real thing.
Very similar spectacle, wasn't it?
Indeed. So what's happening, though, is the left is doubling down and just insulting people it disagrees with. And you can have no better sort of example of this than the Q&A episode of 8 days ago. Scott, you didn't get to hear it, but...
No, I didn't get to see it or hear it or anything like that. And I'm very pissed off that they've taken it down.
Yeah,
'cause
well,
I
I happen to have some of the audio here for you. So this is the part that they were mostly talking about. It goes for about 3 minutes, I think. So hang on for this.
When trying to bring about significant change, when is aggression and violence a better option than assertiveness, strong arguments, and modelling the behaviour you expect of others?
I have a great answer for this that a lot of people do not like. I want patriarchy to fear feminism. And there is a chapter in my book on violence. There is a chapter on my book about white women who voted for Trump and white women who accept crumbs from patriarchy because they allow their whiteness to trump their gender. I'm fully aware of this. But at the end of the day, even those white women have to recognize that nothing protects them from patriarchy. Nothing. For me, as a feminist, the most important thing is to destroy patriarchy. And all of this talk about how if you talk about violence, you're just becoming like the men. So your question is a really important one, but I'm going to answer it with another question. How long must we wait for men and boys to stop murdering us, to stop beating us, and to stop raping us? How many rapists must we kill? Not the state, because I disagree with the death penalty, and I want to get rid of incarceration, and I'm with you on the police. So I want women themselves. As a woman, I'm asking, how many rapists must we kill until men stop raping us?
So, Mona, them's fighting words. Spectator Australia is already saying Mona's promoting violence. Mm-hmm. That's what you're doing?
Well, what I'm doing is I'm saying that violence has been owned by the state. That violence has been given by the state to its police. That violence has been allowed to continue, unchecked mostly, by men, especially privileged men. So exactly how long do I have to wait to be safe?
Okay,
And when I
let me
say
ask
to
Murray,
be safe,
Murray,
there's a
what do you-
hierarchy of safety too. Obviously, people of colour, disabled people, etc.
If I can just jump in, Mona. So I'm thinking, I just want to bring this conversation back to the land that we're on, Australia, whatever. Like, we live in a colonial state, and I think for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are living in a constant state of duress. We experience violence from so many different types of systems. We experience it interpersonally. When you say violence begets violence, there's something kind of, it's almost sounding like it's like a level playing field, which it's not. It's absolutely not. So I think if you're defending yourself, then I think I'm surprised. I wonder what our kind of tipping point in Australia is going to be when people are going to start burning stuff. I look forward to it. We've tried for 230 plus years to appeal to the colonisers' morality, which just doesn't seem to exist. So I think violence is okay. Because, if someone's trying to kill you, there's no amount of, oh, but I'm really clever, I'm really articulate. No amount of that is going to save you. So
It's a tricky really
burn stuff.
I fully appreciate why there was such a blowback over this episode.
Quite extraordinary, really.
It really was. I mean, these women were sitting around calmly and rationally discussing the possibility of violence on the streets.
And they
Not,
didn't
on- not only that, but I would argue these women are somewhat elite in their
Oh, absolutely
given.
they are.
well, we'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that.
But
So-
what about the white women? The white women, it's not just the white men that are the problem now, it's white,
white
women,
women,
too.
yeah.
But why white? Of course, it's because all white people are racists.
Well,
And
because,
privileged
well,
and
because
elite.
the powerful and elite are all white.
It's part of this intersectionality bullshit.
So it's so frustrating that just painting the picture of all men,
As rapists.
there's no nuance in this. Such
None whatsoever.
generalisations
God.
where basically all men are all powerful and they're all rapists and killers and we've got to defend ourselves.
Yeah.
The picture that's painted is you would imagine it was like some street in Somalia or something where people are just raping and killing each other on the streets as you walk down. Like you would, it painted a terrible picture, an exaggeration of what's going on in the world, as if every man was up to no good.
It is so exaggerated.
And as if the thing that gets me is that as if every man is powerful. And
Yes, exactly.
they're not. Like, as we know, it's the 1% who are, but the 99% are not. And to just...
But when are they going to stop raping women, Trevor? And the other thing she said was elite men. She said, when are men going to stop raping women, especially elite men? Whereas we know that the men that are the most likely to rape are men from lower socioeconomic groups in society and, frankly, mentally ill men, I think.
So we've said on the past in this podcast many times in terms of free speech that we're quite liberal about people having free speech to say stuff.
Provided it doesn't incite violence. Now, there was a hell of a lot in that was inciting violence.
Indeed,
sure
that
was.
was the line that we've said you can't cross if you're going to incite violence. And, I guess at one level they were speaking hypothetically and not actually saying go get a gun and kill somebody, but it was not a good look. Like
No,
it
it was
really,
not a good look
at
all.
Yeah, so I can understand the ABC pulling that and saying that was a mistake.
It sure did seem like a mistake.
Even though we're in favour of free speech, what do you think?
Absolutely.
Top man, should
No.
that be pulled or not? Based
Look,
on
I'm
your
not sure
libertarian views.
I'm not sure it should be pulled because it's already out there. Let's face it. Once it's out there, it's out there. You can't completely remove it from circulation. However, I think the ABC should use a bit more judgment, a bit more judicious judgment when selecting panelists based on their record of, what they have said. And Fran Kelly, to be fair, she admitted that she didn't handle it well. But I think she should have done a hell of a lot better in reining that in. But look, I was, the Egyptian American woman was incredibly hypocritical, but at the same time, the Indigenous woman, to me, she just sounded like she had no solutions. I'm not even sure she really understands what the problems are, because for her, it's just about being a colonial state, a so-called colonial state, and Indigenous peoples have apparently, according to her, been trying for 230 years to appeal to the morality of the settlers, and nothing's happening, so let's just burn stuff. I mean, what sort of response is that, really?
Yeah.
That was the thing that I found really disturbing, was how she said it might be time to go burn things. Or she said, no, what she said, it's not all that, what she say? She said, I want to start burning stuff.
Yeah.
Now that was really quite disturbing.
I think the Indigenous woman would have more influence on an Australian TV show than the Egyptian woman, frankly. There are a lot of Indigenous people out there who feel aggrieved, deeply aggrieved. And if another Indigenous person sitting up there on the TV on a panel show, a well-respected panel show, saying, maybe we should just burn stuff, I can imagine some Indigenous people out there in the viewing audience might think that's not a bad idea.
See, why didn't they talk to Jacinta Price?
Well, they could have had her on as an alternative opinion, or at least, a different
Well, normally they're at pains to have people from each side of an argument,
but there was
except for when it comes to secularists or atheists. So the panels are always stacked with religious people, never the opposite. But left and right normally, somebody from the IPA, okay, let's grab someone from the Guardian or whatever. Like normally they're at pains, and clearly somebody from the other side of the fence would have had a field day there and would have just helped stop that. So that was.
Do you think
it's dangerous to create a little echo chamber because
do you
everyone
think
just
it's a
nodded
sign
their heads.
of how far left the ABC has really gone?
This is the whole bloody
Yes,
problem.
I guess.
It is. But, Lee Sales notwithstanding, 7:30 Report is still a very good current affairs program, and you don't get news much better than the ABC. SBS is very good too.
Do you think?
Yeah, it's not too bad.
Oh, I find SBS the most woke channel on TV. Seriously woke, SBS. I heard one of their news presenters, who I think is originally from South Africa, and somebody, they had this sort of mocked up presentation about racism and discrimination. And somebody said something to her, and it was really, really trivial, but it was scripted.
Sent to who?
It was a little piece on. It was a little woke presentation about how to deal with discriminatory treatment. So they had this little sort of scripted, mocked up scenario where one of her colleagues said to her, and I forget her name, said something really trivial, like misunderstood her name or where she was from or something, and she responds with, "I find that offensive." I mean, SBS is 10 times as woke as the ABC, in my opinion.
Right.
They screen these things by what was the name? Yumi, what's her face, who did that presentation on male sexism.
Right.
And then the other one, anyway.
Okay. All right. So your thesis is that SBS is worse than ABC.
Yasmin Abdel-Majid.
Abdel-Majid.
Yeah, she did a piece which was totally crazy on racism, where she had literally 4 people who were supposed to represent the Australian community. One was average white man, another one was an Indigenous woman, and there was, a Muslim and something else. And they were supposed to represent Australian society, a representative sample of Australian society. And they started out with, stereotypical cliched attitudes, particularly the white guy. And by the end of the program, the white guy was admitting that he realised how racist he was. And they all sat around a dinner table holding hands and drinking wine and singing Kumbaya, It was the most bullshit piece of TV I've seen.
I don't know why you
in
subject
years.
yourself to these things.
Well, I do it for the team.
Thanks. Can we just get back to this Q&A episode? And so El Tahawi was this Egyptian lady who was talking the most. And, she was very rude to the other panellists. Like, she would just jump in on top of everybody and blurt out her thing. She wasn't prepared to sort of let people have their say. She had to dominate things. So that would have been just annoying to have her, not just the things you were saying, but just the way that she kept interrupting everybody and putting her 2 cents.
Now, was she the woman that said, how long are we going to let men rape us, before we get violent?
Yeah. Look, somebody I saw online defended her and said, look, she has published material about how bad it is in the Middle East, in basically dominant Muslim societies. And she she defended those young women who tried to run away from Saudi Arabia and things like that. And that's all very well. But at the same time, the way she typecasts white people is just racist.
You're going to have to use some nuance. Otherwise, you're just going to put people off. If you're trying to convince people and you're wanting to affect change, calling every white man on the planet a rapist and a killer isn't going to do it.
And also shaming white women on top of everything.
You're not going to win everybody
as
over.
being complicit.
But Brendan O'Neill, so he's from Spiked, and he had an article in The Australian.
Indeed.
And
That was really good.
I'm a bit of a fan of
you
Brendan.
are Brendan
as you know.
O'Neill, and typically I agree with him when it comes to free speech issues. He's very clear and cogent and speaks well. Just funded by the Koch
Thanks,
brothers.
Brendan.
He's also very right wing when it comes to economic issues. So anyway, he said that
I wouldn't call him a right winger. He's actually a left
No, I
winger.
don't either. In fact, I read something about
You cannot be funded by the
history of
Koch
Spiked.
brothers and be a left winger.
But do you know that?
Please.
Do you know the
Please.
history of Spiked?
He's a left winger. Yeah.
Do you know the history of Spiked? They were Marxists.
He is not a left. He's funded by the Koch brothers.
might
He
have
was
been-
a Marxist.
Do you think the
Trevor.
Koch brothers fund left-wing organisations? Do you?
Well, they wouldn't fund.
And you know the other thing about it was he didn't declare that. It had to be dug out by George Monbiot.
and he was probably trying to keep it quiet because he didn't want to be associated with the Koch brothers because he knew what their reputation was.
Yeah.
Because he's not a supporter of the Koch brothers.
He sometimes
He just wanted the
describes
money.
himself as a Marxist libertarian.
It's not how people describe themselves. It's what they say that's important.
Well, I can see elements of both of them in the things he writes.
Anyway, on this particular occasion, I agree with him because even with the Institute of Public Affairs, I tend to agree with most things they say when it comes to free speech. Like
I do too.
We're really as one. So
I do too.
this is the weirdness of this podcast, dear listener. So.
No, it's not. It's just going back to where it was originally. The free speech was always the domain of the left.
Yeah.
And you tend to typecast the IPA as right wing. I don't think they're all that right wing myself.
They are very right wing on economic issues.
Well, you know, they defend free speech. They defend liberal democracy. To me,
Absolutely,
they're
but-
centre right rather than extreme right. I'll put it that way.
I beg to differ.
Okay.
Coming back to
coming back to this Brendan O'Neill article,
yes, he makes the point that she was painting herself as being an oppressed victim. This is El Tahawi. And he said, El Tahawi has had a privileged life. And he says, I'm using the word privilege in its true sense here. Earlier in the article, he talks about how they've bastardised the word privilege. He said she grew up in a middle-class family in Egypt. Her parents had PhDs. They worked in medicine. They even got government grants to study and work overseas, including in Britain and Saudi Arabia. So she grew up, compared to most Egyptians, in great comfort. In fact, compared to most people on the planet, in great comfort. And so that's an inconvenient fact for someone who's been super keen to be a member of the woke, where being oppressed gives you moral power and social influence. So she's got to paint herself as lacking privilege, and he describes this as a woke form of blacking up. And I think that's a good phrase.
Yep.
I mean, Justin Trudeau and a host of other characters in North America have got into trouble for doing blackface, painting up as blackface, and pretending to be something you're not. Now, when you're pretending to be underprivileged, but you've had a very privileged lifestyle, I like it as a turn of phrase, a woke form of blacking up, where middle-class people self-identify as oppressed to improve their social standing in PC circles and give themselves the right to lecture the rest of us, especially white men, about how dumb and prejudiced we are. So, good.
And
he's-
that we've
he's
got
on
to
the
stop
money.
raping women.
He is on the money there. So, so I think he's pretty clear on that one. Just talk while I get my notes. I've got them on the table over
Okay.
here. Hang on.
What do you want to talk about, Paul?
Well, I think on the same topic. I've got the article in front of me.
Yeah, and it was a very good article. I read the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's identity politics is an extremely binary system. It sees only two kinds of human beings. Those that there are the oppressed who are good, and these include Muslims, black women, brown women, some gay people, not white male gay people, and of course trans people. And there are privileged who are bad. That's the whole point. You've just got it broken down into two people with no nuance or anything like that. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Wheat Watcher says, should Mona have her visa cancelled for future visits to Australia for incitement of violence? And with this one, it's nobody. I think she gets away with it because nobody can seriously think she was actually genuinely saying.
Get a gun and
In
go
other
and
words, it was
kill
just
somebody.
hyperbole
I think
to
so.
get attention because she loves attention, obviously.
I think so. She wasn't being
Yeah.
that concrete and specific enough about it, but she
Yeah.
was speaking in a colourful way.
I was
that
actually more
probably
concerned
means we
about
can-
the Indigenous woman, to be frank.
Right. Yeah.
Because we have a lot of Indigenous people in this country who might actually take notice of her.
Yeah.
I mean, when I say a lot, some.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's burn stuff.
Let's
Again,
burn stuff. Because it was in that TV show that you've talked about, Scott, the one on, screening on ABC over the last few weeks. What was it called? Where was it a white politician, a female politician hired an Indigenous woman
Then she
into the
became a
cabinet.
senator and all that sort of stuff. What the hell's it called?
You don't know the one, Trevor?
Oh, this is the program.
Yeah, TV
it's
show.
I haven't
ABC
seen
on
it.
Sunday
If you
night.
And there was a scene in it where the Indigenous female senator
Yep.
literally hands a can of petrol
Right.
to her boyfriend or partner,
Right, and they burn something.
and he goes out and sets fire to a building.
Right, okay,
So maybe that's where she got it from watching TV.
maybe. Karen says that I'd wager that most women who have the luxury of deciding to major in gender studies are already pretty privileged. Most others need a degree that will result in an income.
Indeed.
But if you parlayed it the right way, a degree in gender studies can get a decent income. I mean, this is the thing. Like, she claims to be without privilege, but you are on Q&A, national broadcaster, having your say. You presumably live in New York or whatever. You've got a degree. Like,
And presumably
please.
the ABC paid her airfare here.
And millions of men who you're decrying as being privileged have no chance of having the sort of soapbox that you've just been given. So
Total
please.
control.
Total control.
Yeah.
Right. Still on the subject. So that's wokeness part 1 was the Q&A. Wokeness part 2. This was from an article I got in the Courier Mail. And now recently Barack Obama has come out and he said he took aim at what he called the call-out culture, where left-wingers are quick to throw tags of racism, homophobia and general bigotry.
And
And
I
he said-
agreed wholeheartedly with him.
What they perceive as bigotry.
Yes. He said that this idea of purity and you're never compromised and you're always politically woke and all that stuff, he said, you should get over that quickly. The world is messy. There are ambiguities. People have flaws. Now, that was his sort of intro to his article. This is by David Penberthy. And he then talks about an incident that happened post-Melbourne Cup. So vow and declare...
Yeah.
An
Australian horse.
An Australian horse wins the Melbourne Cup. We haven't had an Australian.
A great
winner
little
for a
Aussie
while.
battler.
Indeed. And a bit of a success story, a plucky nag, humble owners beats a field dominated by international horses.
Yes.
Feel good story. And ABC journalist Osman Faruqi saw it differently. He saw something sinister and dark. So he was watching Sunrise and he said, on Sunrise this morning, one of the guests literally said, the Melbourne Cup result was good because the winning horse grew here and not flew here, he wrote on Twitter. The culture is so racism poisoned that we're being xenophobic about racehorses. So he read that to be
An expression of racism.
Yes. And
It's almost like they're looking for it, isn't it?
Absolutely, they're looking for it. They're looking for racism under every single rock.
so a guy called Martin Pakula said, being happy that a local horse beat the overseas horses is apparently racist now. We have actually gone through the looking glass, jumped the shark and entered the twilight zone.
Yeah, I love it. I like that.
That is good. Not so, replied Faruqi. Like, he's come back to that.
Doesn't give up.
Responded to that and said, he fired back on Twitter saying, we grew here, you flew here was a notorious racial slur.
Really, as if everybody who flies into this country as a migrant is of a different race, and they're not.
And this
A lot of them are New Zealanders.
the writer of this article says, people like Osman need to recognise a simple truth. With their smug purity, they do more to drive people towards the conservative side of politics than a year's worth of Andrew Bolt columns.
Absolutely.
He's dead right.
He's absolutely right. And I think, and somebody else said it before me, that's possibly one of the reasons the Labor Party failed at the last election, is because people identify the Labor Party with the woke left.
Indeed. And even if they haven't come out in support of these women on the Q&A and they haven't come out in support of Faruqi, there's a perception out there that they would, if asked.
Absolutely.
They
Ask,
need to.
ask Penny Wong.
They need to.
She probably would have supported Al Faruqi.
They need to paint a different picture. Otherwise, they're going to get creamed at the next election as well. People are not going to cop it.
They're slow learners, I think, the Australian Labor
Plus-
Party.
Well,
And
I
it's-
think they should listen to Paul Keating.
What
Yes.
did he say?
Go ahead.
Paul Keating, sorry, just got to find the quote.
I like Paul Keating, but occasionally he comes out with some pretty silly nonsense too.
Yeah, he does, but, you know, where the hell is it? Let me find it. So keep talking amongst yourselves while I find it.
Okay, I've got a third example of wokeness, and this is from an article in the New York Times by Timothy Egan, and he said, "Among the people I love is a sibling who works at Walmart, cleaning toilets at night in a thinly populated area of eastern Oregon. She's been there more than 25 years and has trouble saving a dime, and certainly no path to retirement. She's likely to vote again for President Trump. No matter how much I point out that Trump is trying to take away her healthcare protections by litigating to kill Obamacare, that his tariffs have made it harder to pay her bills, that he is the most repulsive and creepy man ever to occupy the White House, she holds firm. Why? One reason is she hears from the other side. Many Democrats, she says, are dismissive of her religious beliefs and condescending of her lot in life. She is turned off by the virtue signalling know-it-alls." Very true. So that was wokeness number 3. I've got the Paul Keating quote somewhere as well.
I know
Was it
you've
on-
given it in
Yeah,
this.
I don't know where it's gone missing
It's
to.
gone. It's gone.
Yeah. I don't know where it's gone either. But
Ah, here we go. Paul Keating said, the 75-year-old, he's 75, huh?
right.
Yeah, 75-year-old who was first elected to Parliament 50 years ago, said Labor risked losing the vote of the working people unless the party was clear in how it proposed to help them. Hear, hear. You know, you can't just say that we're going to remove franking credits. And we're not going to remove refundability of franking credits without actually saying what you're going to do with the extra money. And that is the whole point. The Labor Party did not say what they were going to do with the extra money.
But they also didn't say how they're going to create jobs for all these people who are losing them or
Yeah.
living on basic wages.
I agree. You know, working people, if they're not sure about the economic framework, they think, hang on, my job's at risk, and so they go and vote against you, even though you're actually trying to help them. Mr. Keating said. There are two big issues I see. That is income inequality, and the fact there is no trickle down means that working people are going to get poorer and poorer unless there's a change in policy. And there's only one party to do that. That's the Labor Party. He's right.
And yet the Labor Party don't know how to achieve that.
No.
They don't know how to do it, do they?
Well, I honestly think that they should have actually had a. I don't take this nonsense that you can have too big a target. I honestly believe that, you know, although they've both failed, you know, Hewson in 93 and now Shorten in 19, I honestly believe that is the fairer way to do things, to go in with a very detailed plan and have it all laid out there. What Labor didn't do was they didn't explain what they were going to do with the extra money they were going to raise.
But don't you think one comment was made that they had too many policies. So perhaps they should, you know, just formulate 2 or 3 really big policies and explain them well.
Well, what were the 2 or 3 big policies?
I don't know what they might be.
This is the whole point. Like, apparently Labor, I've heard this on another podcast, Two Grumpy Hacks I was listening to. Apparently the Labor Party has an election manifesto that just gets added to and added to and added to. And they've never actually sat back and they thought to themselves, we've got to cut this back.
But the thing we've learnt ever since that book, Democracy for Realists, that people don't vote according to policy. They vote on tribal issues. It's their identification with a tribe. That's what they've got to work on.
Yep.
And they've got to say to people, just normal people, are being screwed over. And you may not realise it, but this is how you're being screwed over. And this is how we're going to deal with the people who are screwing you over. It's got to be it's got to be based on identity, because people do not care about policies. They identify with the group and then they justify the policies afterwards.
Was Shorten not being a bit tribal with his carry on about the big end of town versus, you know, the workers?
He might have been, but he needed to sell it better.
He didn't sell it very well, did he?
That's right, yeah.
But he did present himself as a very large target, didn't he?
Yeah.
to the coalition. And Morrison didn't give any target.
Yeah.
He was just knockabout, friendly dad.
It's the daggy dad.
Daggy dad,
But you see,
exactly.
as part of selling it when you're attacking the big end of town, is you have to say to people, you realise your chances of being in the big end of town yourself are not very good. Because
negligible.
the problem with, say, America is you can produce policies to super tax the rich, and the poor will say, I don't want that, because they're convinced
That
they're
they
next
can
year,
join the big
when
end
all
of
of their
town.
ducks line up in a row,
That's right.
they're going to be in the rich.
That's
so
right.
they need to be educated. Actually, your chances of social mobility are lower than they've ever been, and your kids' chances are going to be even lower. So it's part of that story as well, where people think, well, actually, I'm half a chance of being in that group if I play my cards right. Well, no, you're not.
It's the American dream, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and
Part
is
of
that
it.
it's a dream. So that's all part of the story is explaining how you've been shafted, and
And why
people
you're going to continue to be shafted unless you change your vote.
exactly. And who is shafting you? Those guys over there vote for us, and
Even small business people, people who buy a franchise are getting shafted.
yes,
And they are the people who believe that they're joining, the entrepreneurs of the world and, making themselves as success stories. And yet they're being shafted by the parent companies who sell the franchises.
the
to them.
landlords and exactly. Yeah.
And then they pass on the injustice to their workers by underpaying them.
But for years, buying a franchise has essentially been buying a job. So it's coffee shops and other things are pretty much been people who've maybe been retrenched from a reasonably well-paying job, got a bit of a nest egg, who really can't get another job, who then essentially buy a job by buying a franchise. That's what they've been about.
I've been told if you buy a McDonald's franchise, you're pretty sure to make a decent living out of it.
I don't know about that.
That's
But years ago, it would have
Years
been. I don't
ago-
know about
years
that.
But
ago
they're
they
not
were-
cheap.
No,
You're looking
you-
at probably $1 million or a couple of million to buy
Absolutely.
a McDonald's franchise.
years ago they were a license to print money. They're not so much that more anymore.
Manic Man says, don't forget the commercial media are dead against Labor and always will be. So, that's true. I mean, I made some notes here.
Well, I would have thought that if you look at the Nine papers now that are owned by Nine, which used to be Fairfax, they are still fairly evenly handed in
Yeah,
their
I subscribe
editorial.
to the Sydney Morning Herald, and it's the same as the
But
Age.
take Queensland, for example. All, the Courier Mail and all of the regional papers.
They're all owned by the
all owned by Murdoch.
Murdoch, yeah.
Yeah. So, so we're moving on to the topic now of this review of the Labor's loss, and my thoughts were that Labor needs an elevator pitch to explain basically four things: that the Liberals have been bad economic managers. Like, I have this argument with people who are friends who say, well, we're heading for tough times. We need good economic managers in place, and the Liberals are the best economic managers.
Well,
And
they've sold that image quite successfully.
Exactly. It's bullshit, but they've sold it and aided and abetted by the Murdoch papers. The second thing is that people need to be told and explained to them that the neoliberalism is a con job by the powerful who's screwing the average Australian. The third thing is this whole notion of government and tax and red tape. We've got to clear it out. There's nothing good in government at all, and it's all about the individual and his family, and there's no society. Like, Thatcher was wrong. There is actually such a thing as society. Like, you've got to sell that story. And the fourth thing would be you just cannot trust anything you read in the Murdoch media, and that's what you've got to get through to people. Four basic things I would have thought if I was writing as to what they need to do. But in terms of what the Labor review said, let me just see here. They did internal statistical analysis of trying to find categories who swung from Labor, and basically they came up with these groups that they identified, which was voters aged 25 to 34 years living in outer urban and regional areas, So
And that goes very much to what you said, how the Labor Party looked at them and said, well, you're working in the mines, you're fucking the environment, you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Yep.
But they didn't actually say to them, we can create more jobs if we build windmills, solar farms.
or maybe they'd even look at what options they had. Like it's hard to rattle off what the alternatives are, right? Isn't it?
Well, the alternatives were never presented by the Labor Party, but they should have been presented.
I still think the coalition made a huge mistake letting the automotive industry go offshore,
yes,
because that provided thousands and thousands of jobs, not only directly in the assembly plants, but in the allied industries.
given the money that's been poured into other things,
Such as submarines.
yes,
Yeah.
there could have been.
Yes, they had to subsidise the industry, but they subsidise other industries, don't they?
Yes, yeah, yep.
What's the difference? And every country with an automotive industry subsidises that industry because they know it keeps manufacturing vibrant in the economy,
Yes, and in terms of, we talk about our defence of this country, like having the ability to make some metal widgets, maybe exploding ones down the track, or anyway, but just an
of
ability.
whatever kind.
Or maybe, trade's cut off with key people and you can't get stuff anymore. The ability to actually make a few things yourself
It's very
is a
useful.
good,
It's
handy.
a strategic asset, really, isn't
Well,
it?
you look at Cuba. They're still driving around in cars from the 1950s that they had to keep going because of the American embargo. So
We could be the Cuba of the future. do you
we
think?
could be. We could end up being embargoed by China or the United States or both.
According to Crikey as well, it seemed that really the decision making as to what the policies would be came from just a very small group.
Yeah, that was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Just around Shorten. So just a handful of people are basically making decisions on the fly. And there was this culture of, we've got this in the bag. If we all just shut up and show unity, we'll win this.
Exactly. That seems to have been the mindset. And in fact, apparently there was a review done after the previous election,
Right.
and Shorten said, don't want this released.
And
For
it
whatever
said,
reason.
And it said we need more input. To
We
it.
don't know what
Right,
it said because
okay.
nobody saw it outside the inner circle of the Labor Party.
Yeah. So anyway, that was the bits and pieces from the Labor.
But they were
review.
getting polling, apparently. They were certain members of the Labor Party were getting polling showing that they weren't doing that well, actually, and they were
Yes,
going
yeah.
backwards.
Yes.
But they didn't act upon it because apparently Shorten was keeping such a tight rein on everything that he just wanted to keep going with the same message
This is
that
the
he
thing,
had.
our politics has become far more presidential than it used to be. When Hawke was in power, he
used to run the cabinet like he was the chairman of the board.
yes.
He would sit there and he'd just listen to what everyone had to say, let them argue amongst themselves, and eventually he'd sit down and he said, right, we've got to make a decision on this.
And it was arguably one of the most productive and constructive cabinets that Australia's had in recent
Absolutely,
history.
yeah.
So that's all gone by the wayside, and someone like Morrison is just running the rock show as he feels like it. So
Because
Unfortunately.
he's got a direct line to the big man upstairs, apparently.
Do you think we could resurrect Hawke, bring him back to life?
No, I
and
don't think so. I think he's
bring
gone.
back the old cabinet? Get the band back together, so to speak?
well,
Well, I think even if you could bring him back to life, I don't think Paul would work for him anymore.
right. New topic. Our friend Noel Pearson has joined an advisory group to design the Indigenous voice to governments. And so, prominent Indigenous leader Noel Pearson, a leading proponent of constitutional recognition for Australia's First Peoples, will join the advisory group. And he's among 17 notable Australians appointed on Friday by Indigenous Affairs Minister Ken Wyatt. So there's a number of people there that are listed. Mick Gooder, co-chair, Joint Council on Closing the Gap. Pat Turner, prominent Jesuit priest and lawyer Frank Brennan.
he always
Gets
gets
a
a
Can't
looking, doesn't he?
understand why he's got a Guernsey.
He always gets a looking because he's a priest.
This is the man.
Allegedly, that qualifies.
This is the man who said
That
the,
he
seal,
would,
the seal of the
the confessional
confessional
is inviolable.
yeah,
I will not break it.
I will disobey the law.
Exactly.
And he keeps getting put on panels to decide what our laws are going to be.
Exactly.
when he doesn't give a
makes
shit
no
about
sense
some of them.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
He's selective.
So he gets a Guernsey. A bunch of other people get a Guernsey. There's sort of 17 of them. But here's the one that stood out to me. As somebody who gets onto this panel, this advisory panel on Indigenous affairs, Sky News Australia presenter and columnist for The Australian, Chris Kenny, is on this. How does that happen?
Chris Kenny.
I could
how
understand
does it-
that coming from this
I
as
know
a
how it's
Morrison
happened.
appointment.
I know how it's happened, but it's
just not
please,
right.
Now
Yeah.
we've jumped the shark and we're
Absolutely.
looking through the looking glass and we're down rabbit holes and like all those metaphors. Like, for goodness sake, that anybody from Sky News could be given any position of potential authority, please.
I mean, it's just been there that he can try and slow them down. And, I think he's trying to put them on constitutional recognition.
Let's hope.
You think he's going to put them off it?
Well, that's what I reckon, yeah.
No, well, I don't know.
Well, it's an advisory group to the government rather than something written into the Constitution, isn't
Right.
it? That's the way it's
Basically,
going, isn't
it sounds to me like they're trying to resurrect ATSIC.
it? That
which-
might not be a terrible idea.
No, it's probably not a bad idea.
It would be preferable to me to having some sort of special privilege written into the Constitution
Absolutely.
for one ethnic group of the population.
I agree wholeheartedly.
What do you
with
think? If we had a Labor Party in government right now, don't you think they'd be looking at writing it into the Constitution? I suspect the woke left of the
Would.
party would be pushing that really hard.
Absolutely, they
would.
would be.
So thank heaven for small mercies, do you think?
No, because if you're going to change the constitution, you've got to get past the public in a referendum. I don't think it would work.
You don't think it'd fly?
Ultimately, I think the Labor Party dodged a bullet anyway because there's a nasty recession on the way. Like I can
And
tell
they
you.
won't have to wear responsibility for it.
Yes, because if they were in charge now, my mate Mike and others would be going, look what the Labor Party's already done to the country. It's already shutting down just because those guys are in.
So right-wing Tony's going to have to eat his words a bit, do you
So
think?
it wasn't right wing Tony was saying that, but it still could have been a good one to lose because they totally own our financial situation. They can't blame anybody else, even though they want to blame the Greens for.
Oh, they will.
Yes,
course.
but you should be able to make a case. No, in 2.5 years' time, when we're really in the poo in terms of a recession. We could say there's
so-called
one
good
group who've been
economic
in charge
managers.
for the last 9 years is you guys.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're to blame. You got us into this
Wear
mess.
it.
Yeah, right. But anyway, just back to Noel Pearson. Language warning, dear listener. There's an explicit rating put on this podcast when you subscribe to it. So
If there isn't, there should be.
yeah. So there is but we don't. It's unlike the Q&A panelists. We don't just drop the F word willy-nilly. Only when it's relevant, and I'm about to. So if there's a kid nearby, don't let them hear
Put
this.
them to bed.
Yeah. Just back to Noel Pearson. What can we expect from him when he's in a meeting with people? And I'll remind you of an article we did probably years ago now, Scott, where Indigenous leader Noel Pearson is alleged to have called Malcolm Turnbull a white cunt, Indigenous Minister Ken Wyatt a black cunt, and Indigenous Labor Senator Pat Dodson a fucking black cunt. In what one witness described as an offensive tirade outside the Prime Minister's office.
That's great, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's going to go down really well at the meetings,
Yeah,
isn't it?
if the meetings don't go his way, that's perhaps what you can expect. Good luck in that one.
No, I think Noel Pearson's got a screw loose somewhere, frankly, because he believes in Jesus. Here's an
traditional.
so-called indigenous leader who rages against the colonial, probably the colonial, oppressors, and he believes in the colonialists' Jesus. For goodness sake, doesn't he see the contradiction in that?
Apparently not.
Okay, Boomer.
Careful.
Have you heard that one, dear listener? Okay, Boomer. Have you heard that one?
No, who said that?
Well, it's a saying.
It's a saying.
Okay,
Everyone's
boomer.
saying it.
Yeah, okay, Boomer. So
It's to shut people up of your generation.
yeah.
because you lot were the ones that raped the country.
Oh, I see. Yeah, we're the ones that live in big houses and drive 3 Jaguars and have a holiday house down at the Gold Coast.
You've got to get used.
Absolutely.
You've got to get used to people who, you know, when you go on a little bit of a rant and they just go, "Oh, okay, Boomer," it's like an eye roll. So this is from the New York Times. It's an article that says, "Now it's war. Gen Z has finally snapped over climate change and financial inequality. Teens say, okay, Boomer is the perfect response because it's blasé but cutting. It's the digital equivalent of an eye roll."
Okay,
So, yes.
I'll have to get used to it.
It's a response to what's perceived to be some older people's sense of entitlement, outdated ways of thinking, or condescending attitudes towards younger generations. So expect to be hit with an "okay, Boomer" statement every
Okay,
now and
I'll
again.
brace
If you
myself.
hear it, it's quite condescending. Right. We don't strike anymore, Scott.
No, and we should strike more.
Are you
So
ready
is that
to
a
go
call
on
for
strike?
violence?
No, it's not a call
peaceful,
for violence.
peaceful strikes.
Look, how about this? You go on strike, and while you're standing outside the gates, you throw petrol bombs at the building.
Right.
No, you shouldn't do that.
You-
No, it's just there's a disturbing stat here somewhere. I just got to find it, which says that we went from being about 50% of us in the trade union movement in the 1980s down to about 20% now. Now, I'm a member of a trade union.
So am I.
I became a member
Well,
a
it's
few
not a
months ago.
Trade union.
you're a member
It's
of
a professional union.
Yeah, Professionals Australia. Yeah,
Professionals Australia.
yeah.
Okay.
Because
Who can be a member of Professionals Australia?
anyone that's a professional.
Only the elite.
Yeah.
No, this
Well, what
is
do they
not.
classify as a professional?
Well,
I'm
okay, an accountant, a lawyer, an engineer. Now, they're
Okay.
basically they started out life as a professional engineers association, but they decided to branch out and take over
Okay.
everyone.
is a teacher a professional?
Well, they are, but they've got their own union.
What about podcaster?
Well, podcaster, we
They
don't.
need
Profession-
their own union
as a
if they
professional
don't have one.
podcaster.
Well, we don't have a union to be a podcaster because we're self-employed.
Well, there could be employed podcasters.
There could be employed podcasters. I assume.
But
they
are
would,
there enough of them to?
Well, I would assume
a
that
union?
I'd assume that they'd go under the same union that you would if you're a radio presenter.
Yeah,
Oh, the entertainment industry.
I
union
couldn't tell you whatever
of
it
some
is.
sort.
Yeah.
it's okay. I'll just keep the strike option up our sleeves as podcasters. But yes, you're right, Scott. 15. Yes. But on this particular article I've got a link to, it talks about the working days lost to industrial disputes per 1,000 workers per quarter. And back in 1985, it was nearly 80. And now it's down to about 2 days, 2.5. So
Big
a
drop.
huge drop.
It's
in the,
almost non-existent now.
and even in construction, where the militant SFMMEU allegedly runs amok, the days lost on average last financial year was 10.5, and that would have been a quiet year when John Howard was Prime Minister.
It's been a very quiet year.
And in mining, another CFMMEU stronghold, no strikes were recorded at all in the first 2 quarters of 2019.
Because they pay their workers well.
Yes. Yes.
That's the whole point. You know, if you want to eliminate strikes, you've got to pay your workers well.
So that's interesting. Well, and I'm in the middle of reading a book, dear listener, which I will get to maybe next week and talk about. But this journalist in America decided to go and work for Amazon in one of their picking warehouses. She worked for a call centre, and she also then went and worked for McDonald's. And it's about her experience working on minimum wage in the United States and what she came across. So heaven help us if we get to that point, but if we're not careful, we will.
Agreed.
Right. How are we going for time? We're going
You're
for a bit
about
over an hour or so.
15 minutes. or
Yeah.
thereabouts.
Let me just see if there was. Just on China. 12th man. Are you worried about young people gaming too much? Playing computer games too much?
I think it could be a little unhealthy for them if they game too much. I'm not personally worried about them, but yeah.
Right. Wouldn't it be good to have an authoritarian regime that could just crunch down on
No, it
game?
wouldn't.
On
Turn off the games at 8 p.m.
Yeah. So I've got a link to an article here. The Chinese government has released new rules aimed at curbing video game addiction among young people, which is leading to a rise in nearsightedness and poor academic performance. And the regulations announced by the Chinese government on Tuesday banned users younger than 18 from playing games between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. And they're not permitted to play more than 90 minutes on weekdays or 3 hours on weekends.
Sounds
just
quite
said that's it.
sensible,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
One of the side benefits of
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 an
it.
authoritarian
That's it.
regime, that they can do stuff like that. Wouldn't get away
No,
with it in
I
Australia.
don't think
course
that
not.
they should be allowed to do that. However, they've done it, and I can understand why, but I don't think it's right.
Yeah, it is an infringement of personal liberty. I mean, surely parents should be.
One would have thought the parents would be restricting them from playing
Well, parents should be
those
responsible
hours and that sort of
for it
thing.
anyway.
Yeah.
Now, you sort of poo-pooed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez last week, said she does nothing.
She's woke. She's extremely woke.
Well, she sticks it to people as well. So,
She sticks it to the patriarchy as well, doesn't she?
well, she's sticking it to a company in America, and the company is called Gilead. Scott? People who are fans of The Handmaid's Tale
would have just
would
woken up
know,
there,
would
yeah.
know that
The United States becomes the Republic of Gilead.
Yes, and there's actually a company called Gilead, presumably named before.
Before the Handmaid's Tale.
Mind you, though, The Handmaid's Tale has been around a long time. The book, at least.
The book has
Now,
been
have you
around for a
finished the
long
book
time.
yet?
No, I'm about 90% through.
What are you doing in your spare time?
I know.
Dear listener, I said to Scott, you've got to read, if you're a fan of The Handmaid's Tale,
I've got to read the book.
you have to read the book. And in particular, you have to get through the first book so that you can read the sequel that she's just put
The
out called The
Testaments, yes.
Testaments, because it's so good. It's the best sequel you'll ever read.
Well, the Testaments I'll be reading on Sunday afternoon. Actually,
Right.
I'll be getting to the Testaments on Sunday night, I would imagine.
Right. And
And then I've got to ring you up when I get to the thing. Go, oh my god,
That's
I know
right.
how this is going.
There's,
So-
there's going to be an oh my God moment. And I said, ring me when you get to it. And you'll just go, wow. Okay, but back to Ocasio-Cortez. So she was videotaped in front of this inquiry because Gilead are the makers of HIV prevention drug Truvada, also known as PrEP. And there's a lawsuit that accuses the pharma company of exploiting public research dollars to make billions without giving American taxpayers their return on investment. And she asked pharma why, the pharma executive, why the life-saving drug cost nearly $2,000 in the US and $8 in Australia. And his answer was, well, because we've still got a patent here that we can use. And that's why it is what it is. So that's the sort of thing that America needs to hear. Like, she talks in a plain language, so I like her. Religious discrimination bill, haven't heard much lately, but I came across an article from Freedom for Faith, and they said if it were to go forward unamended from its draft state, it could not be properly supported. We are quietly confident of a better response than that, but watch this space, ! So that bill is going to be even worse than the original draft.
Yeah.
And all of the submissions that have been made will just be ignored.
Ignored.
And what will the Labor Party do when it's presented to the
They'll
Parliament?
probably roll over.
They'll roll over like a puppy. Say, scratch my tummy, please.
That's it. Yeah. And finally, let's finish off with Indigenous fury at eateries' use of native flora.
Yeah, that was ridiculous, wasn't it?
Bush Tucker, 12th man.
Absurd. Totally
Bush
absurd.
Tucker.
The
So-
idea that Indigenous people actually own a patent of some sort on anything that is, native to the Australian landscape.
So there's a group of Indigenous Australians who are furious that restaurants and others are using native ingredients on high-end menus, and they say it's treating sacred ingredients as cash grab. The sort of ingredients we're talking about are sea succulents, kakala, saltbush, finger limes, and wattle seed. And Bunjalung Man and SBS
There you go.
on-country kitchen host
The
Mark
most woke
Olive
channel on Australian TV.
said he was happy to see ingredients that are mainstream, but he did not agree with the lack of respect shown.
What does that mean? You use a finger lime, you squeeze a finger lime over your grilled salmon. You're not showing respect to somebody.
These ingredients are an important part of Indigenous culture and history, and people need to know the stories behind it all.
Oh, Jesus Christ. It's like welcome to country. Every time you sit down to a meal and you squeeze a finger lime over your fish, you've got to have a
welcome to
a
country.
welcome to country ceremony before you eat it, before you tuck in. Give me a break.
It's really ridiculous, isn't it? I mean, Jesus Christ.
It's
Can't
borders
these-
on the absurd. doesn't
Can't
it?
these guys
Cultural
accept-
appropriation is essentially.
So should we, wheat, the wheat that we all use and enjoy around the world originated in the Middle East, didn't it? Isn't that where wheat was first
certainly wasn't in
systematically
Australia.
cultivated? So what about our Indigenous people who eat bread? They're not showing respect
to the Middle East.
to the Middle Eastern people who first cultivated it.
Potatoes, tomatoes, and I think chili
South
came
America.
from South America.
Absolutely.
So
Are we being disrespectful to the Indigenous people of South America by eating tomatoes?
it's terrible.
Jesus Christ.
It's really ridiculous.
It's
this,
really
this
ridiculous.
whole thing that I read, I just thought none of this makes any sense.
The whole point of multiculturalism is to take bits and pieces
From
of culture,
everything. Exactly.
drop stuff of your own that's no longer appropriate, adopt stuff of other people that is, mix and match and move onwards and upwards.
The internal combustion engine was invented in Europe. Are we being disrespectful to the Europeans by driving, Korean-made cars?
So there's a lady here who had a business and she's been frozen out of the industry because she's not on the list of approved Indigenous suppliers. So she's
And
been
that's
sort
quite
of
sinister,
boycotted.
really, isn't it?
It's very racist.
It's absolutely racist. And it's sinister to think that people can manipulate a commercial enterprise like that.
Yes.
But she's white. She's part of the patriarchy.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Well, she's privileged.
yeah. So there we go. That's the end of a woke awareness episode where,
It was really quite depressing, wasn't it?
yeah, it is depressing.
And it shows how much we have to push back against this whole woke culture. We
Yes.
really do. I mean, we can be, in our heart of hearts, we can support left causes like equality,
Yep.
wage justice, all kinds of human rights.
Yes.
But we've got to push back against this ridiculous postmodernist intersectionality woke culture. It's just absurd.
Yep. These people who are claiming special privilege because of their differences rather than equal rights
Exactly.
despite of their
Exactly.
differences have got it wrong. Like
Exactly.
Martin Luther King would be rolling in his grave.
Yep.
If you're on that panel at Q&A, you would have said to that woman, they talked about violence as being the only response left to them. And I was thinking at one point, well, is that what Martin Luther King said? Like, wasn't it peaceful protest? Was
That's
the
right.
idea of the civil rights
That's
movement?
right.
They
Even
didn't say-
Gandhi, who wasn't white
Yep.
either,
Yep.
it conducted non-violent protests to get rid of the British.
Yes. Yeah. So,
I mean, they were pretty good role models, I would think. I would have thought.
yeah. So,
And yet now it's fight violence with violence. When did that ever work out well?
yeah.
Didn't work out at all.
Yeah.
Well, in the world wars, maybe, but in terms of social progress within a country, violence doesn't really achieve very much of any good, does it?
Well, unless you've got the best weapons and the power, which
That's right. Sure.
And women will not have. If they want to go around murdering and killing and using violence, they're clearly going to lose on
They are.
that score. So,
Hey, just on cultural appropriation, our friend Wheat Watcher from Scotland, he's not happy. He says no one seems to be culturally appropriating haggis.
I've eaten haggis, mate. It's not very good.
Maybe you just didn't have a good piece of haggis.
I had some haggis when I was in Scotland all
they
those
might have
years
got a
ago.
dodgy, you might have got a dodgy haggis.
Well, I don't know. Just when they were selling haggis at a Christmas market. You tell me if this is true, Wheat Watcher, but they were selling haggis at a Christmas market. I thought, I've got to try some haggis seeing I'm in Scotland. It was ghastly.
Right. It's a sheep's
It's
stomach.
a sheep's stomach that's filled with stuff, and then you boil it up. Yeah.
Right, yep. Yeah.
Ghastly.
What could possibly go wrong?
It's enough to make you go vegan.
Right. Well, that's been good. We've had good people contributing in the chat room. Much appreciated to those who hung in there. Gentlemen, I think we can sign off. And next week, Bill Gates on wealth tax, and maybe I'll get to Steven Pinker. Maybe we'll see how we go. I've got to deal with Warren's accusations that I was straw manning people, so I've got to deal with that. Righto. Well, thank you very much, dear listener. We will talk to you next week.
Thanks very much for tuning in. Bye now.
See you all.
Bye.